Okay, so before I start this story, I need you to understand something very important. I'm not the kind of person who talks about himself. I never have been. I grew up being the quiet one, the one who sat in the back of the class and watched everyone else live their dramatic lives while I just existed. Unremarkable. Invisible. That was me. And honestly, I was fine with that. I had my routine, my comfort zone, my walls. And I thought those walls were permanent. I thought I had everything figured out. I thought I knew exactly who I was. And then she happened. Her name was Anya. And she walked into my life like a storm that doesn't announce itself. No thunder, no dark clouds, no warning at all. Just suddenly the sky changed and everything was different, and you're standing there soaked to the bone wondering what just happened. That's what Anya did to me. And what followed over the next 3 months was the single most humiliating, terrifying, emotional, and strangely beautiful experience of my entire life. And yes, it involved me becoming a girl. Sort of. And no, I didn't plan it. And no, I didn't want it. At first. But let me start from the beginning, because if I just jump to the transformation part, you're going to think I'm making this up, and I promise you, I'm not making a single word of this up. I met Anya at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. I was sitting at the end of the table trying to avoid conversation when she sat down across from me and said, without any introduction, "You have the saddest eyes I've ever seen on someone who's pretending to be okay." I remember blinking at her. I remember not knowing what to say. Nobody had ever said anything like that to me in my entire life. People don't usually look at you that closely. And she was looking at me like she could see through my skin straight to whatever was hiding underneath. It was uncomfortable. It was terrifying. And for some reason I couldn't stop smiling. We talked for 4 hours that night. Everyone else had left. The restaurant staff was cleaning around us and we were still talking. She was studying psychology, which should have been my first clue, honestly. She was sharp and funny and had this way of asking questions that made you want to answer honestly even when the honest answer was embarrassing. I told her things that night that I hadn't told my closest friends. I don't know how she did that. I still don't fully understand it. We started spending time together after that. Just as friends at first, or at least that's what I told myself. We'd get coffee and she'd show up looking effortlessly put together. Always some light flowy outfit, always smelling like something warm and floral, always with her hair doing exactly what it was supposed to do. And I'd show up in whatever wrinkled thing I'd grabbed off my chair that morning. She never said anything about it. She just looked at me with that expression, that slightly raised eyebrow, that little smile, like she was quietly filing information away. Things between us got complicated fast. By week 3 I was falling for her in a way that scared me. I'm not good with feelings. I'm not good with vulnerability. I'm definitely not good with telling people how I feel. So instead of being honest, I did what I always do. I deflected, I joked, I kept things surface level. And Anya, being Anya, saw right through it. The situation that started everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon. We were at her apartment, studying. She was working on a paper and I was pretending to read something while actually just watching her, and her roommate Priya came in with a bag from some clothing boutique. They started going through the things together and I made some offhand comment. Something stupid. Something I immediately regretted. I said something like, "Girls spend so much time on this stuff, it's kind of ridiculous." I don't even know why I said it. I think I was jealous of the easy intimacy between them. I think I felt left out. But it came out sounding dismissive and condescending, and I knew it the moment it left my mouth. Anya went very quiet. That particular kind of quiet that is so much louder than anger. Priya looked at her and then looked at me and then quietly picked up her bag and found something very important to do in the other room. Anya closed her laptop. She turned to face me fully. She said, very calmly, "Do you actually think it's easy?" I tried to backtrack. I said I didn't mean it like that. She said she knew I didn't mean it badly but that I meant it, which is different. She said she'd noticed that I had a way of casually minimizing things I didn't understand. She said it wasn't the first time. And the way she said it wasn't cruel, it wasn't an attack, but it landed like one anyway because it was so precisely true. I apologized. She nodded. We moved on. Or I thought we moved on. 2 days later she texted me and said she had an idea. She said she'd been thinking about what I said and she thought there was a way to help me understand things better. She was vague about the details. She just said she wanted to try something and asked if I trusted her. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I was in love with her. I would have agreed to anything. She said to come over on Saturday morning and to not ask too many questions beforehand because she wanted to see my genuine reaction and not a rehearsed one. I spent the rest of the week going slightly insane with curiosity. I asked her exactly once what she was planning and she just sent back a single emoji. The little smiling face with the halo. Which somehow made it worse. Saturday morning I showed up at her apartment at 10. She opened the door looking extremely pleased with herself in a way that made me immediately nervous. Priya was there too, sitting on the couch with her legs tucked under her, holding a cup of tea, grinning at me like I was the most entertaining thing she'd seen all week. I looked around the apartment. There were things laid out on the kitchen table. I couldn't fully see what they were from the doorway. Then Anya stepped aside and gestured grandly toward the table and said, "Welcome to your education." On that table was a full face of makeup. Foundation, concealer, eyeshadow palette, mascara, eyeliner, blush, lip colors. There was also a hair curling wand, some clips, a headband. And folded neatly to one side was an outfit. A light pink flowy top and some white wide-leg trousers that I later found out were Priya's. I stood there. I stared. I said nothing for about 15 seconds. Then I said, "Absolutely not." Anya said, "Absolutely yes." I said this was not what I agreed to. She said I agreed to trust her. I said trusting her didn't mean letting her turn me into a girl. She tilted her head and said, "Who said anything about turning you into a girl? You're just going to spend today learning what it actually takes. You said it was ridiculous. Let's see how ridiculous it is when you're the one doing it." And there it was. Her revenge, wrapped in a psychology experiment wrapped in genuine friendship, and I couldn't even be mad at it because it was actually kind of brilliant. I looked at Priya for support. Priya raised her tea mug at me like a toast and said, "I'm just here to watch." I said fine. I said fine because even standing there terrified I could see the logic of it, and also because Anya was looking at me with that expression, that slightly challenging, completely confident expression, that made me feel like backing down would be a kind of failure I didn't want to live with. She sat me down at the kitchen table in front of a small mirror they'd propped up against the backsplash. Priya came and perched on the counter nearby with her tea. Anya pulled up a stool beside me and said we were going to start with skincare because apparently I couldn't just put makeup on a face without preparing the face first, which I did not know and which already, 2 minutes in, was expanding my understanding. She walked me through cleanser and toner and moisturizer with SPF and an eye cream. She explained why each thing existed. She wasn't lecturing, she was genuinely explaining, the way she explained everything, with patience and detail. I found myself actually paying attention. I found myself asking questions. The eye cream was because the skin under your eyes is the thinnest skin on your face and it ages differently. I had never once in my life thought about the skin under my eyes. I said this out loud and both of them laughed and Anya said, "That is exactly the problem." Then she picked up the foundation and explained undertones, and I will tell you honestly that I could not have told you before that day that there were warm undertones and cool undertones and neutral undertones, and that using the wrong one makes your face look like a mask. She found a shade that was close to mine, slightly light but passable, and showed me how to apply it using a sponge. "Damp," she said. "Always damp." I applied it the way she showed me. She corrected my technique twice, gently, showing me the difference between patting and rubbing and why one of them lifts the product back off. About 20 minutes in I realized something strange was happening to me. The concentration required, the focus, the precision, it was calming. It was like a different kind of thinking. I'm a person who lives in my head, constantly, and this required me to be entirely present with my hands, with my face, with the tiny details of what I was doing. It pulled me out of my thoughts in a way that felt almost medicinal. Anya moved on to concealer under the eyes and showed me how to blend it out in a triangle shape, not just dab it on the dark spots. She showed me color correction, which is an entire science on its own. She explained how green cancels red and peach cancels blue and purple brightens sallow skin, and I sat there genuinely floored by the complexity of something I had dismissed in less than a sentence 2 days earlier. Priya at this point had abandoned her tea and come to sit in the chair next to me to watch more closely. She said, "He's actually not bad at this." Anya said, "I know, he's too careful not to be." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I kept blending. The eyeshadow was where things got genuinely difficult and also genuinely interesting. Anya explained the structure of it. Transition color in the crease, darker color in the outer corner, lighter color on the lid, highlight on the inner corner and the brow bone. She showed me on her own eye first, quickly, with a kind of effortless skill that made it look like it required no thought. Then she handed me the brush and I tried it on myself. It took 4 attempts. 4 attempts and a full removal in between because the first try was too heavy, the second was uneven, the third looked like something had attacked me. The fourth was still not quite right, but Anya said it was the best version and I believed her because I was tired and my eyes were watering slightly from staring so hard in the mirror. But here's what I want to tell you about that 4th attempt. When I looked at myself in the mirror with the eyeshadow blended out and the concealer and foundation underneath, with those things on my face that I had put there myself, with my own unpracticed hands, I felt something shift. I can't explain it fully. It wasn't that I looked dramatically different. It was subtler than that. It was that I looked at myself and saw someone who had done something difficult and gotten somewhere. The face looking back at me had a kind of softness that my face doesn't usually have. And I didn't hate it. I think that surprised me more than anything else. The mascara was next, and Anya said everyone has trouble with mascara at first and not to panic. I said I was not panicking. I then very nearly poked myself in the eye with the wand and Priya made a noise that she tried to disguise as a cough. Anya said to open your mouth slightly while applying because it relaxes the muscles around the eye. I said that made no sense physiologically. She said she didn't care if it made sense, it works, just try it. I tried it. It worked. I applied the mascara without incident. I said nothing about this. The blush and lip color happened faster than I expected. Anya said I had good bone structure. She said it clinically, like she was noting a useful fact, and that the blush was almost doing the work by itself. She showed me how to smile and apply along the apples of the cheeks and then blend up toward the temples. She picked a dusty rose lip color that she said was close enough to my natural lip tone that it looked intentional without looking theatrical. Then she looked at the outfit on the table. I followed her gaze. There was a silence. I said, the makeup was the deal. She said, the makeup was part of the deal. I looked at her. She looked at me. Priya was very carefully studying the bottom of her empty tea mug. Here's the thing. Here's the thing that I haven't told anyone, that I've thought about many times since, that I still don't fully have words for. I wasn't as resistant as I expected myself to be. There was still the fear, the social conditioning, the self-consciousness, the voice that said this is weird, this is not who you are, someone is going to see. But underneath that voice there was something else. Something quiet and curious that had been there for a while and that the last 2 hours had nudged awake. I'm not making a dramatic declaration here. I'm just telling you what was true in that moment, in that room, with the morning light coming through Anya's window and mascara on my lashes and the knowledge that nobody outside that apartment would ever have to know. I said, fine. But if you tell anyone I will deny everything. Anya said, I told you this was an education. Lessons stay in the classroom. I changed in the bathroom. The pink top was flowy and soft against my skin in a way that I was not expecting. The wide-leg trousers were surprisingly comfortable. I stood in the bathroom for a moment and looked at myself in the full-length mirror on the door. The reflection was strange and interesting. There was something in it that I didn't look away from as quickly as I wanted to. Something about the softness of the silhouette and the color and the face I'd spent 2 hours working on. I stood there longer than I should have. When I came out, Anya was sitting on the couch and Priya had curled back up in her corner, and both of them looked up when I emerged, and there was a moment, a brief, suspended moment, where neither of them said anything, and I stood there genuinely terrified of what they were going to say. Priya said, okay, wait. Anya said, I knew it. I said, knew what? Anya said, sit down. Your hair next. I sat down on the floor between her knees because that's where she directed me, and she worked the curling wand through sections of my hair. I have enough hair for it, apparently, which she said with entirely too much satisfaction, and the whole thing took another 40 minutes and neither of them talked about how I looked, and I was grateful for that even though part of me was dying to know what they were actually thinking. When she was done, she handed me a small handheld mirror and told me to look. I looked. I sat with it for a long time. The person looking back at me was not unrecognizable. I could see myself, my features, my face, the things that are specifically mine. But they were framed differently. They were presented differently. And there was something in the eyes, which were my eyes, the same eyes, just slightly defined now, that looked more awake than I'd seen them look in a long time. More present. Less defended. I said, "Okay." Anya said, "Okay, what?" I said, "Okay, I think I understand what you were trying to show me." She moved around to sit in front of me and she looked at me carefully and she said, "What do you understand?" And I thought about it. I actually sat and thought about it before I answered, which is not something I usually do. And then I said, "It's not about the time it takes or the skill it requires, though both of those are real and I massively underestimated them. It's that this whole process, every part of it, is a way of paying attention to yourself. Of deciding deliberately how you want to be seen and what you want to present and taking the time to make that happen. It's an act of intention." And I called it ridiculous without understanding that. Anya didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, quietly, "That might be the most insightful thing you've said in the 3 months I've known you." I said that wasn't a very high bar. She laughed. And then she said something that I've thought about every day since. She said, "The thing about you is that you've spent so much time being invisible that you've started to think being seen is dangerous. But look at yourself right now. You let yourself be seen. You survived it. How does it feel?" I looked at the mirror again. I looked at myself, pink top, mascara, soft curled hair, a face that had been attended to with care, and I thought about her question. How does it feel? And the answer that came was not the one I expected. It felt like something I'd been holding very tightly had loosened slightly. Like a window had been opened in a room that had been closed for a long time. Not everything was different. I was still me, still the person who sat at the back of the room and kept his walls up. But something small and real had shifted and I could feel it in my chest like a change in pressure. I said, "It feels okay." Anya smiled. And it was the kind of smile that meant she'd heard the real answer underneath the small one. We spent the rest of that afternoon in her apartment. I didn't take any of it off for hours. We watched a film. We ordered food. At one point Priya taught me how to do a simple nail color and I did one coat on my left hand before immediately removing it, which still counts. They asked me about things, about my childhood, about why I kept myself so contained, about what I actually wanted from my life, and I answered more honestly than I usually let myself. It was as if the costume, or the experiment, or whatever it was, had made a small gap in my usual armor and things were coming through it. At some point in the afternoon Priya went to take a nap and it was just me and Anya and the quiet of the apartment and the afternoon light going gold outside the window. She was reading and I was not reading, I was looking at the ceiling thinking, and she said without looking up, "What are you thinking about?" I said I was thinking about how I'd spent years judging the surface of things without asking what was underneath them. She said she knew. I said it was a bad habit. She said most of our worst habits are just old survival strategies that stopped fitting. I said that was a very psychology way of putting it. She said she was a psychology student. What did I expect? Then I said, and this is the part that scares me to say even now, I said that sitting there, with everything still on, I didn't feel ridiculous. I felt a little strange and out of the ordinary but not ridiculous. And I said I wasn't sure what to do with that. She finally looked up from her book. She looked at me with that direct, unhurried attention of hers and she said, "You don't have to do anything with it. You're allowed to just have an experience without categorizing it immediately. Not everything needs a label or a decision. Some things are just true and allowed to exist." I said okay. She said okay. We didn't talk about it again that day. But I drove home that evening and I sat in my car in my parking spot for a long time before going inside. The makeup was mostly worn off by then. My hair had fallen mostly back to normal. I was just me again, in my regular clothes, in my regular life. But inside something had rearranged itself, and I could feel the new arrangement even if I couldn't name all the pieces. I thought about the word she'd used. Revenge. She'd never actually used it. That was the word I'd used in my head when she proposed the whole thing. I'd walked into her apartment thinking this was some kind of playful punishment for my thoughtless comment. And yes, there was probably some mischief in it. I'd be naive to think Anya hadn't enjoyed the poetic justice of it slightly. But when I sat with everything that had actually happened that day, it was so far from punishment. It had been, and I know this sounds strange, it had been a gift. An uncomfortable, unexpected, completely unwrapped kind of gift. The kind that requires some assembly. In the weeks after that day, things changed between me and Anya. Not dramatically. Not in the way that romantic movies would have you believe things change. But in quieter and more important ways. I stopped deflecting as much. I started asking more questions and fewer rhetorical dismissals. I started paying attention to the surfaces of things instead of using the surface to judge what was underneath. And Anya started looking at me a little differently. Like someone who'd placed a bet and was beginning to see the results come in. I eventually told her how I felt. Not on some grand occasion. We were in a bookshop and she was reading the back of something and I was standing next to her and I said, quietly, as if it was just another sentence, that I thought I was falling in love with her. She kept looking at the book for a moment. Then she put it back on the shelf. Then she looked at me. And she said, I know. I've known for a while. I said that was unfair, she had too much information about everyone. She said that was the hazard of paying attention. I said was she going to say anything else? She said she needed to think about it. I said okay. We bought our books and we left and she texted me that night and said she'd been thinking about it and the answer was yes. That was not the end of the story, obviously. Things with real people are never that clean. We had complications and disagreements and long conversations about all the things that are hard to talk about. I was not a perfect partner. I still had those walls, still had those habits, still reverted to distance when things got hard. And Anya was not patient in the gentle, soft way, she was patient in the honest way, which sometimes hurt more. But we built something real. And the foundation of it, the thing that made it possible, was a Saturday morning in her kitchen where she refused to let me stay comfortable in my own ignorance. I think about that day more than I talk about it. I think about the way I looked in the mirror and recognized myself differently. I think about what it meant that the recognition didn't frighten me as much as I thought it would. I think about what Anya said, that some things are just true and allowed to exist without labels or decisions. And I think there are things about myself that day helped me begin to accept. Not announce, not explain, just quietly accept. The person who spent those hours paying careful attention to their own face and finding it interesting. The person who tried on softness and didn't immediately need to take it off. I'm not making any declarations. I'm just saying that I know myself a little more honestly than I did before. And that knowledge came from the most unexpected place. I never thought that the worst thing I ever casually said would turn into one of the best experiences of my life. I never thought that being humbled, and it was humbling, genuinely, to sit there and realize how wrong I was and how much I didn't know, would feel like being freed. I never thought the person who would see me most clearly would be someone I'd known for 3 weeks. And I absolutely never thought that mascara, a pink top, and a curling wand would be the instruments of my education. But here we are. If there's anything I want you to take from this, and I almost didn't tell this story because it feels so personal and strange and I wasn't sure anyone would understand it, it's this: the things that make us uncomfortable usually do so for a reason. And that reason, if you're willing to look at it honestly, is almost always pointing toward something you need. Whether that's understanding you've been withholding from others, or honesty you've been withholding from yourself, or softness you've been protecting yourself from feeling. Anya saw something in me that first night that I hadn't let myself see. And she found the most creative, slightly devious, entirely perfect way to show it to me. Her revenge, if you want to call it that, was turning me into the kind of person who looks in a mirror and actually sees himself. And I think, honestly, that's the best thing anyone has ever done for me. I still have that lip color, by the way. The dusty rose one. She gave it to me when I left that day, slipped it into my jacket pocket without saying anything. I found it that night when I got home. I've kept it in a drawer. I've never used it again. But I haven't thrown it away either. And I think if you understand why, then you've understood the whole story.